Very much. The two heroines. I hope we'll have some fun with this tonight. I don't know if you read that little 1954 review, which Dom posted on the website, where the reviewer described the stories thin to the point of transparency, written to order for a late Victorian magazine. Well, it is a short story. It is allegedly a Christmas story. And it's the only short story set in Barsetshire, and we'll come back to all of those. It's written in 1882, which is significant because Trollope died between the submission of the story and its publication, so he had no opportunity to revise it. It was published in Good Words, although the Christmas edition, just to be confusing, was called Good Cheer, which this was. Good Words, fascinatingly, is a Victorian magazine directed at evangelicals and nonconformists, mainly of the lower middle class. And that, I think, is significant too when we get into the story. It's quite salutary to read Trollope's own view on short Christmas stories from his autobiography. This is not about this story, but his writing, I think, about the period 1875 to 6. And a little quotation may be quite interested. I was called upon by the proprietors of the graphic magazine for a Christmas story. I feel with regard to literature somewhat as I suppose an upholsterer and undertaker feels when he's called upon to supply a funeral. He has to supply it, however distasteful it may be. It is his business, and he will starve if he neglect it. Nothing can be more distasteful to me than to have to give a relish of Christmas to what I write. I feel the humbug, interesting word, implied by the nature of the order. A Christmas story in the proper sense should be the ebullition of some mind anxious to instill others with a desire for Christmas religious thought or Christmas festivities, or better still, with Christmas charity. Such was the case with Dickens when he wrote his first two Christmas stories. I've done 2 or 3 before. Alas, at the moment I have one to write, which I have promised to write within 3 weeks of this time, as to which I have in vain been cudgelling my brain for the last month. I can't send away the order to another shop, but I do not know how I shall ever get the coffin made. Well, I wonder if that's Trollope's view of this short story as well. There's an interesting little reflection, shamelessly pinched from Victoria Glendinning's biography of Trollope about this story, and a reminder of Trollope's own past. When Trollope married Rose in 1844, Rose's father, Mr. Heseltine, was a bank clerk with no public school education. So was Rose's father a gentleman or not? What would she bring to the marriage with Anthony? And of what standing was Anthony in working for the post office? Is Trollope's own life a mirror image of Mr. Greenmantle and Emily? Does what I shall suggest is some of the irony of the two heroines have some source in the ambiguity of Rose's father? Interestingly, her father was a noted figure in Rotherham, a town in Yorkshire. Yet between 1836 and 1853, he was discovered to have regularly and systematically embezzled funds from the bank and went into exile and shame. Our story, set in Barsetshire, has shades of Rose's growing up in Yorkshire. But here we are in Barsetshire, Plumplington, the second town in Barsetshire, a town of 20,000 people. And interestingly, Trollope notes, with 3 banks and no member of parliament. There's perhaps a little sign of dis-ease there about the current state of affairs. But in the story, we're immediately into Trollopian parallelism and pairs. Emily Greenmantle and Polly Peppercorn are the only children of widowers. We have no knowledge whatsoever of their past life or past history. They are friends in spite of what Mr. Greenmantle sees as a social gulf between them. Mr. Greenmantle is manager of the local bank and aspires that Harry Gresham would be a suitable suitor for his daughter, although the Gresham estate is not what it was. Emily only has eyes for Philip Hughes, a bank clerk, and it does not meet with her father's approval. Hickory Peppercorn is a foreman of the local brewery. He doesn't have particular plans for Polly, except that her suitor, Jack Hollicombe, a local malt salesman, is equally unsuitable. Mr. Peppercorn, incidentally, had no money when he married, but has made money in the course of his career. The final key character is Dr. Freeborn, the rector of Plumplington, who will be an influential figure in guiding and shaping the key relationships. It's worth pondering whether this is the key role of a parish priest in a parish of 20,000 people, and what it says about Trollope's view of how he fills his time, trying to plot romances and to subvert something of the social order. He is also, Dr. Freeborn that is, a significant reference point in terms of his position in society. Mr. Greenmantle's family sank into insignificance if you looked beyond his grandfather. But Dr. Freeborn could talk glibly of his ancestors in the time of Charles I. Given the hostility of the fathers to their two lovers, Polly is a model of passive aggression before the term was even invented. In protest, she changes her fine silks for old gowns so as to lower her social standing in her own eyes and be more of a match for Jack Hollicombe. In this, she assumes her father's assessment of his and her standing. Ironically, a girl has to begin where her husband begins. What she brings most to her father at this point is shame, because he is ashamed of her new appearance. On the other hand, Emily is afraid of her father's sternness. Polly is not afraid of her father, and there is actually a hint that the reverse might be true. Both fathers have some money, which both daughters believe they will one day inherit, which obviously means that one day their fathers will be dead, interestingly. But both fathers make it clear they will only bestow the money on them if they make the right and appropriate decisions about their wedding partners. Money here is a significant bargaining tool and an indicator of their position in society, and a revisiting of Trollope's understanding of the role and place of money in relationships. Interestingly, the two fathers have different views about their money. Mr. Greenmantle considered himself to be infinitely superior to Mr. Peppercorn, and to be almost, if not altogether, equal to Dr. Freeborn. He was much the richer of the two men, and his money was quite sufficient to outweigh a century or two of blood. Mr. Greenmantle delights in positioning himself as a gentleman, so he eats dinner at 7:30, which is not at all to his liking, but it is the fashionable time for a gentleman to eat their dinner. He was a gentleman and saw himself as acknowledged so by all the county. The old Duke of Omnium had invited him to dinner at Gatherum Castle, although if it was the old Duke of Omnium, this would seem to have been at least 10 years beforehand, and but a fading memory. If Polly's passive aggression is in changing her clothes, Emily's is in refusing to eat, and she begins a battle of wills with her father. There is a delightful scene in chapter 3 of Trollope at his best in conveying socially awkward situations, when Mr. Peppercorn comes to talk to Mr. Greenmantle at the bank. It makes Mr. Greenmantle especially angry when it's suggested that Emily and Polly are behaving in the same way, and that Polly and Emily are being talked about together, when in Mr. Greenmantle's eyes, Emily is a step above Polly. This sense of social positioning is a common theme throughout this little story. Who is superior to who? If you come from England and you have long memories, I was taken back in reading this story to the Frost Report, I think, where there were three men of different heights, played by John Cleese, Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett, whose conversations went in the terms of, I look down on him because I am upper class and he is middle class. And the man in the middle says, and I look down on him because I am middle class and he is lower class. And the man at the end says, I know my place. It's a repetition of what is happening in this story. Dr. Freeborn has his own perspective on the two men. He did not see the difference between the banker and the brewer nearly as clearly as Mr. Greenmantle. He would probably have said that the line of demarcation came just below himself. Jack tries to persuade Mr. Peppercorn that he truly loves Polly, and it's not all about money, and that he'll wait as long as it takes. Jack has no money and no education. Mr. Peppercorn dreams of Polly being married to a gentleman, which Jack definitely isn't. He also recognizes Polly's stubbornness and hints and intimates that she would ultimately get the better of him, and he feels powerless in the face of his daughter. Parenthood and money are not as powerful as they might have been. At the beginning of chapter 5, which we're told is the end of November, Dr. Freeborn has not made any progress with his machinations. It's said of Dr. Freeborn, he considered that everybody ought to be happy just because he told them to be so. He was a force of nature in Plumplington, we are told, but in what ways? It ironically comes to light that Dr. Freeborn belonged to another set. Mr. Greenmantle wanted in a son-in-law blood, an old family name, country associations, and a certain something which he felt quite sure Philip Hughes did not possess. But we are told that Dr. Freeborn's daughters, in their marriages, had all of these. We're told that there was a consciousness that the rector had been entitled to expect so much for his girls, and that the banker was not so entitled. In the light of the pressure, Dr. Greenmantle resolves to take Emily away, and to take her away from her dangerous lover, Philip. He's planning to take leave from the bank in order that in going to Europe, there might be a suitable suitor for Emily. Mr. Greenmantle tells Philip that he is going, and Philip makes the mistake of telling Mr. Greenmantle that he could do the work in his absence, whereas Mr. Greenmantle believed that his own duties to his thinking were the most important ever confided to a bank manager. Philip protests his love for Emily and that Emily wishes to marry him. And he longs, on hearing of her departure, to see her once more before she's taken away, seeking reassurance of her love and to profess his love for her. He goes unannounced to Emily, and of course Mr. Greenmantle enters at an inopportune moment, and that doesn't end well. Emily implicates Dr. Freeborn in the contrivance of this meeting, which does not impress her father. Dr. Freeborn, he says, is simply the rector of Plumplington, nothing more. Mr. Greenmantle needs not only to remove Emily from Philip's pursuit of her, but also from Dr. Freeborn's interference. He believes that they should depart the next day. Emily says that this is impossible with no clothes sorted out, and Mr. Greenmantle grudgingly agrees. And then Dr. Freeborn intervenes again. He instigates Mr. Peppercorn to consider going to France. This is enough to persuade Mr. Greenmantle not to go. He cannot have Emily and Poppy paired like this. And when Mr. Peppercorn hears that Mr. Greenmantle is not going abroad, he resolves the same. This has kept them at home, but not resolved the marriage question yet. Emily then plays her passive-aggressive card, takes to her bed and won't eat. We're told that the reader is not to suppose that Emily Greenmantle intended to deceive her father. Emily stays in bed, and Mr. Greenmantle acknowledges that he is beaten. He ought, according to the rules of justice in the world, to have had plenary power over them, but it had come to pass that his power was nothing. Polly similarly fights her corner with her father. He is still protesting that he has the right to choose the sort of son-in-law that his daughter should marry. Polly insists that she will marry Jack with or without her father's money. Her defiance is enough to allow Jack to be able to talk to Polly. And Mr. Peppercorn settles an annual allowance on her, and she gets her man and some money. Mr. Greenmantle learns all of this, of course, from Dr. Freeborn, and also has it spelled out to him that Emily's ailments are all related to her love for Philip Hughes. He, too, is now fully worn down. He was, in truth, very like Mr. Peppercorn, though he would have been infuriated had he been told so. Both couples are to be married in February, and the denouement is set for Christmas Day. I think we've completely forgotten that it's about to be Christmas and Christmas Day, because that has not figured yet in this little short story at all. But Dr. Freeborn invites everyone to Christmas lunch. He also somewhat gratuitously invites Harry Gresham. This is just as well, because in another of those socially awkward scenarios that Trollope does so well, it is Harry who keeps the lunch going, having made it clear that he is not in the market for either Polly or Emily. Mr. Greenmantle is reluctant to go to the lunch because he is anxious about whether he should be sitting down to eat with Mr. Peppercorn. Rank is rank, you know, and it behoves me to be careful with whom I shall associate. Dr. Freeborn is of the view that all should come and eat together, because they'll have been to church and shared in Holy Communion together, although even the church service needs careful handling. And so it is at the opportunity to come and receive Holy Communion. Mr. Greenmantle walked up proudly to the altar amongst the earliest and most aristocratic recipients, and as he did so, could not keep himself from turning round to see whether Hickory Peppercorn was treading on his kibes. But on the present occasion, Hickory Peppercorn was very modest and remained with his future son-in-law nearly to the last. This carries over into the seating plan for the meal itself. Mr. Peppercorn felt himself to be placed a little above his proper position and could not at once throw off the burden, and Mr. Greenmantle would not make the attempt. There is a measure of resolution. The fathers make speeches. Emily and Polly are on first name terms again, and the weddings are booked. So what are we to make of this story? At 58 pages, I think, although I'm happy to be corrected, that this is one of Trollope's longer short stories, if I can put it like that. And I think it raises the question of what do we expect of his short stories, especially this one, as at the beginning it has many of the hallmarks of the structure and potential for a longer work. And I wonder if, in the light of this, we expect a little too much of it. and the Barchester setting. Is this necessary? Or is this an old man looking wistfully back to a world that is passing away? In the light of Trollope's later novels, this is a return to a world in a sense that has gone by. Was it important to Trollope to visit it one more time? Perhaps nowhere more than in this character of Dr. Freeborn. He is, after all, rector of Plumplington, but here he is matchmaking and interfering in a few families. Is that endearing or slightly sinister? What does Dr. Freeborn do all day? And how come he has the time on his hands for this? And then again, a Christmas story, written specifically for the Christmas edition of a magazine. Trollope's Christmas stories, as we've seen, have none of Dickens' sentimentality or encouragement to behave differently in the light of the story or the spirit of the season. What does this story specifically show under the guise of its seasonal setting? Is Christmas simply an anchor in time for the narrative, or is it in some way an inspiration to behave differently? I've already suggested that the general provenance and appeal of the magazine Good Words, Good Cheer would have been precisely to bank managers and brewery foremen, who would have been its target audience. And yet, even within those spheres of work, there are very powerful questions of rank and class that remain. Dr. Freeborn would have them all equal at the communion table. But these two self-made men have a very clear sense of their standing within their own class. In the story, money that they have made is powerless when love is at work. It could be argued that both fathers seek at some point in the story to weaponize money and to use it to coerce their daughters to behave in certain ways. But their daughters, abetted by the rector of all people, will have none of it. Good Words would certainly have promoted that sense of equality before God, but those responsible for that publication would still have had a strong sense of tradition and the ordering of life, especially in terms of father-child relationships. And it's that which Trollope seems to subvert. It was actually Mrs. Freeborn who sent out the invitations for Christmas lunch, and in which she referred to the two heroines of Plumplington. Mr. Greenmantle was not impressed by this. Though you each may be a heroine in your own way, you are not the two heroines of Plumplington. I do not choose that you shall appear together in that light. Emily suggests it's only a joke, to which Mr. Greenmantle riposts, it is a joke to which I do not wish to be a party. The two heroines of Plumplington, it sounds like a vulgar farce. So is it? Is it a slight tale of love overcoming obstacles and finding its fulfillment, which finds its climax at Christmas lunch together? Or is there a slightly subversive element to this story? It emphasizes the passing of an age in which not only Victorian money does not get its way, and the daughters run rings around their fathers and get their own way. I do have a passing thought about what the future relationships between Jack and Polly and Philip and Emily are going to be like when they've got off on this footing. And then again, there is the beginning and the end of the story. That sense at the beginning of a large town with no MP yet. And the final words as the Christmas meal ends. Then Polly walked home with her father, who, however well satisfied he might have been in his heart, had not many words to say in that evening. So have you read a slightly charming tale of the triumph of love over adversity, or a slightly subversive take on late Victorian family values and relationships? I leave that question for you to ponder.